We live in a goal-driven society. Everything is so fast, just so relentlessly fast, and we push ourselves so hard. I think we end up neglecting our own inner well-being a lot of times, and then we suffer for it. Even unconsciously we suffer, For me, the thing that was really working was climbing up the mountain behind our house and going deep into the woods. I would cry out there. I would touch a tree, and it was kind of crying from happiness, and it's just connection. So for me, that's one of my powerful connection practices, spending time in the woods alone, and one that I've had since I was a child. As a kid and a teenager, kind of a disturbed teenager, I would go to the woods and I'd feel okay.
Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I'm Maura James, and this week we are hanging out with Morgan Caraway. He and his wife Mary Jane live on a property a couple hours outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and they are incredible educators in sustainability, specifically sustainable building. They have built the house that they live in out of earth bags, which we'll get into in this conversation. And he teaches regular workshops where people go out to their property and get hands-on experience learning how to make their own earth-based dwellings. I wanted to talk to him because he has been so intentional with his life, making this really accessible to people, especially people like me who are coming out of New York City for over a decade. And I'm very eager to make some shifts, but can be a little daunted by just the technical know-how. He's also a fantastic writer. He's written several books, including Ecological Awakening, which I read this summer. And I just wanted to start with a little passage from that because I took away most from this conversation with Morgan was relief. A lot of relief in acknowledging the despair that I and so many of us are feeling right now about the state of the world, and letting go of a lot of that panic and really focusing in on what is possible on an individual and community level. And that was a really needed reminder. I think I found some agency again in the face of a lot of sadness, which can be totally paralyzing. So in one of the early sections of the book, he has a kind of a question and answer about how to think about ecology. And the question is posed, what is the point of awakening if the majority will likely never experience it? He says, time and time again, unsustainable civilizations have come into existence and then collapsed. Often, in the latter stages of society, egotistical infighting and corruption will tear the social fabric apart from within, while bad farming practices and poor resource management tear it apart from without. Though many great civilizations have disintegrated this way, humanity has survived so far. For each of us that awaken, we increase the chances that some of us will survive the fall of our own unsustainable cultures. We also change our way of living and lessen the burden on the biosphere. Ecological awakening leads directly to personal action. If you see the reality of the situation, you can't help but act. Ecologically awakened people create sustainable communities. We recognize that when the planet's life support systems are hurt, we are too. When enough trees are chopped down or when the oceans become too polluted or warm to support phytoplankton, we are messing with our very ability to breathe. There is no dividing line between us and the environment. Skin is just a membrane. Every cell in our body has a membrane, and this doesn't make them separate from our body. We are part of the earth, just as individual cells are part of our body. Seeing this clearly is the end of the war against our larger body and our human and non-human neighbors. He's really special, and this conversation was very open and honest about where we are in this particular moment, in our lives personally, dealing with what's happening on the bigger scale, and how to decompress a bit from the pretty immense anxiety that being in the middle of a falling civilization creates in our nervous system and our human compassionate hearts. As a sidebar, I recently started listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast, which I was turned on to by Reddit's End Stage Capitalism feed. And it's awesome. So far, I've listened to the end of Roman Britain and the Mayan collapse, and it just really struck me. It put into context these historical stories that we think of as these sort of monolithic moments in time. And I was like, oh yeah, those empires are made up of regular people just like me, who were just trying to survive and hang out and love their partners and feed their children. And a lot of them became politicized and became resistance fighters because of the greater machinery that was forcing them into these cities and ways of living that were completely unsustainable. So yeah, I just wanted to recommend the Fall of Civilizations podcast to y'all. I also want to give a shout out to forest bathing, which is a concept that Morgan introduced me to. It's from Japan, called Shinrin Yoku. It was popularized in the 1980s, and it just basically involves going out into the forest. And I love that that's something that Morgan has done intuitively and then discovered that there was this very intentional container for it in another culture. So let this be an invitation to you to do some forest bathing this week. Go put yourself out there with the green things and the growing things and listen in to what they want to tell you. All right, here is the wonderful Morgan Caraway. Enjoy. Cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Name, rank, and serial number. Well, my name's Morgan Caraway, and at this point in my life, I guess some of my main projects are natural building and teaching natural building. I'm part of a small intentional community called Bottom Leaf. You know, we have a community property where we all live. I'm into a lot of stuff. I'm into music and art and writing. I probably should give a few of them up, but you know, I don't know. I just can't. I can't narrow my interest down too much.
Hey, why do that? Yeah, I feel that pressure sometimes too to focus down. Then I'm like, if it needs to come out, it needs to come out.
Yeah. Well, some people just say, just do one thing, and I can see the appeal of that. Like, what do? I'm a musician. Okay. That's simple. You just play music and you play it more and you play it more. But I can't make myself do that. I just want to go towards whatever I feel like I'm drawn to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I was wondering so I found you through following Sustainable Living?
Sustainable Life School, yeah.
Sustainable Life School, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what sustainable means. I feel like that's very much in the zeitgeist, but I wonder for you.
Well, for me, sustainability is, something that's perfectly sustainable can be sustained indefinitely. A way of living or a way of doing things that can continue for an indefinite period. For me, I feel like Native American cultures or, indigenous cultures all over the planet, some of these cultures go back 10,000 years, 20,000, of course even further as you go into prehistory. So they were living in a way that was sustainable with a sustainable population and sustainable ways. So I feel like a lot of what hasn't been sustainable has been since the Industrial Revolution, especially, just really the past 100 years, maybe you could say 150 or so. But I feel like that's when a lot of the things that can't be sustained started. To me, sustainability is very simple. If something is truly sustainable, it can go on indefinitely, at least until something from the outside stops it or interferes with it.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest symptoms of our broken relationship with the earth that you feel like you are addressing?
Well, it's all a learning process. I grew up in standard American society, and, I had parents that loved me, and I think there were people that cared about me as I was growing up. But there was so much information that was left out. There were so many things that weren't addressed, that weren't talked about. So for me, it's been a process of self-education. I grew up in a mobile home, so that's the kind of housing that I knew as a child. And I purchased one when I got a little bit older, and then I started researching natural building. The first book that really kind of woke me up was The Hand-Sculpted House about cob building. And that was a big awakening for me. The idea that you could build your own house and you could build it out of non-toxic materials, and it's much stronger than anything else available. So I guess, as it's gone on, I've tended to kind of specialize in the natural building part, especially earth bag building. But once again, it's just been a self-education process and, trying to make my own life more sustainable and my family's life. And there's still a long way for us to go. And, we're part of this culture that throws things away so easily, produces so many objects, taking so much energy and resources, and then throws those things away and puts them in a landfill. We're kind of born into that mentality. So challenging that is kind of a tall order, and that can go pretty far and take some real engagement to really challenge it. And I think it's very worthwhile. I think every little small thing anybody does with a consciousness of trying to keep the bigger planet and the bigger humanity and life from suffering and getting polluted with all these different toxins and junk, I think anything anybody does in that direction is worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like we're all, anybody, and I'll include myself in this because I'm not working at the moment on like a property that I can make self-sustaining. We're living in some form of denial, I think.
Denial and dependence.
Uh-huh.
We're dependent on a lot of systems to work, meaning, if one chain in this breaks down, for example, fuel, gas. I was just in Florida, and a full week before this hurricane's even expected to hit, my dad gets a call, and one of his friends is saying all the gas stations are selling out of gas. Everything we have in our lives, the food that we get off the grocery store shelves, the items that we get from Amazon that we order, everything on every grocery and supermarket and store shelf in the U.S. is brought there using petroleum. Mm-hmm. So if one small thing gets interrupted in that chain, if access to petroleum gets interrupted or something like that, then we see how dependent we are on external things to be able to even live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's the end point of that in 10 or 20 years?
Right. I've seen more and more as I go that this whole modern culture, society, our values, what we hold to be important, everything is really based on petroleum. And this energy, amazing energy source that we have in the form of it. I think I saw something that was saying 1 gallon of gas is equivalent to like 1,000 man hours, something like that. We have this amazing energy source that our life is built around. And of course, some people point out, well, it's going to run out at some point. So, I think we do see the stirrings of people wanting to switch to renewable energy, sustainable energy, and we do have the technology to do it, certainly. But unfortunately, there's a lot of vested interests who still profit from selling gasoline and coal and fossil fuels, and they have a heavy say in our government, and a lot of lobbyists, very powerful, loud voice. So unfortunately, we're not seeing those necessary changes being made.
Mm-hmm. Do you see greed as kind of the driving force of the insanity of the self-destruction that's happening now?
I think so, yeah. To me, and I talk about this a little bit in Ecological Awakening, but the thing I figured out, and this may be right or wrong, but this is what it looks like to me. So the core of all of our dysfunction is the belief in separation. Some would call it the ego, but the belief that we're separate from life and we have to kind of be in an adversarial relationship with life and other beings, and we have to fight and struggle to have our needs met. So I would say the root of it is that belief in a separate self. And then with that belief in the separate self, isolation, the belief in isolation, comes fear, because if you're in the ocean and you're a little bubble, you're afraid of being popped. One tiny little pinprick and you're gone. So from the belief in isolation comes fear. And then greed, I think, is an attempt to address that fear. And I think the idea is if I can accumulate enough, then I'll be safe. Mm-hmm. If I can get a big enough mansion, surrounded by a big enough estate, protected by enough guards, then I can potentially be safe. So that seems to me to be how it goes. But as I say in Ecological Awakening, I feel like we've got to get to the root. Because if we just address the symptoms, I feel it'll just continue in another form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now that's, a pretty profound awakening that I feel like many different philosophies are trying to help people arrive at. How did you get there in your life?
Well, my life I've run in so many circles of people. I've hung out with so many different people, and I've had a lot of different belief systems as I've gone. I grew up a musician, so I was surrounded by musicians, and a lot of which are open-minded, interesting, smart people. And then I got into spirituality. You know, I was a seeker from the time I was in my teens until I think it was sometime maybe around 2008. I felt like I had found the answers, and you know, I wouldn't call it enlightenment necessarily, but I felt like a lot of the burden that I felt as a seeker, and a lot of the sense of isolation and the sense of imperfection and the sense of wanting to be more and all of this, I felt like a lot of that dropped away around 2008. And I was big into Advaita Vedanta, which is basically non-duality is the way we speak of it here in the U.S. Advaita is the same thing, not two is the meaning of it. So, you know, I felt like I had that awakening, and then I had internalized a lot of these concepts from the non-duality material, and like spontaneously one day I was washing dishes, and it just like I realized how little I actually knew, and it was mind blowing. It was just such a humbling thing, and a little scary, and a little shaking. You know, it really shook me to my core to realize that. But a lot of these things I had gathered and gained, and a lot of spiritual wisdom and all these things just kind of were gone. And that was really ultimately pretty freeing, you know. But then after that, you know, I tried to look at life for myself. I tried to not look at it through the lens of what other people had thought. And, you know, some of these realizations I feel like are from this time period since then, when one could say maybe the slate was wiped clean, and then I've been able to look on my own. And it's an ongoing process, you know, like I have stuff I'm into now that I really wasn't into even a pretty short time ago. You want me to talk a little bit?
I would love that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I realized not long ago, like, how much collective trauma there is. And, you know, I spend some time on social media. I look at Facebook. I have a lot of well-meaning progressive friends, and they share a lot of information, and a lot of disturbing information, you know, a lot of really disturbing. I don't know if the human nervous system is made, I don't know if we're meant to have that much disturbing, threatening, scary information put through us.
Are you talking about sort of like apocalyptic alarmist stuff?
Well, I am, but you know, even the mainstream scientists now, even like 4 years ago, the discussion was a lot more muted, and you know, they were saying, no, everything's okay, you know, we're going to warm up a little bit, there's going to be, but now even, you know, the mainstream scientists globally are, you know, saying, hey, we've really got to address this, you know, climate change and the amount of carbon and, you know, so many other factors of what's happening. So I feel like I was in a bubble of innocence/ignorance for a long time. And then I actually had a friend he was part of the Doomers. And the Doomers are people who think we're all going to be dead. Like one of my friends is a Doomer. He's a nice guy. As I think most Doomers are well-meaning people. But they're like, we're all going to be dead. And 10 years is like the short scale. 20 years is a little bit more, would you call it optimistic? We've got 20 years before we're all dead. I'm not a Doomer, by the way. But I had a friend who was one. And he was like, hey, this is all serious. We need to wake up. So I went through a brief stint trying to be a Doomer, you know, and I just couldn't do it. My heart couldn't. Well, plus, you know, my wife was pregnant with our son at the time. So it's, you know, the prospect of, oh, we're all going to be dead in a decade and you're about to be a father. I couldn't just wallow in despair. And my opinion still is I will do whatever I can, especially for my son, because parenthood changes your priorities, you know, I think almost invariably. I just realized I'll do whatever I can to keep him alive and happy and have a future. I'll do whatever I can for him to have a future. Yeah.
What do you see it doing to people who are sort of dwelling in that constant exposure to the...
Well, I saw what it was doing to me, I think. I've kind of been going through, a little rough spot. You could call it depression, a little spot of it maybe. Not like laying in bed all day. I don't have time for that. But I'm thinking maybe that amount of information about all these troubling subjects is a heavy burden. And I was talking to a friend last night. We had her daughter had a birthday party, and they were at our property, and we were getting to talk a little bit. We're given this information. Say, for example, in the morning, I would get up and I would read my Facebook feed. So I'm seeing this real intense, like earth-shattering, horrible news. And then my son, is trying to engage, and I've got to get the day started. So you don't really have a time to process all this information. You're just swallowing these big chunks of kind of despair, and then you're like, okay, let's get moving. And I think it might have a cumulative effect. So I'm doing an experiment, and I've done it before. I'm taking a news fast, and I'm just going to attempt to focus on what I can do something about. And I know what I want to achieve, and I know methods to get there. So I think that's what I need to focus on. Like, yes, there's a lot of very troubling problems out there, but as long as we're doing what we can to address it and moving forward, then I think we're doing the best we can do.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate your transparency around that, because I've been feeling that a lot too. I think especially with the news of I feel like I'm going to cry just talking about it, the Amazon being on fire the last couple of weeks.
That's been a big one. I think that one, for me, I see this trend, and it is disturbing, but, Trump is one example of it. Bolsonaro, Morrison in Australia, Boris in England. Unfortunately, I think fear is making people even less rational and less able to address things intelligently and to look at what's really going to fix it. And unfortunately, this fear is driving them into the arms of politicians who know how to capitalize on that fear very well. And generally, these politicians demonize someone else as the problem, which is has a long history, that tradition. And it gives people an enemy. And it gives them, some kind of sense of, once we either get all these people out of our country, or, the Nazis took it to one extreme, but once we deal with that, then everything will be okay. And then there's just a wide-ranging denial of all the information and the facts we see. My dad is a Trump supporter, and I have talks with Dad, and I'm like, Dad says it's all just politics, and like, are the melting ice caps politics? And he can't really.
He can't let it in.
He can't argue with it, but I don't think he's fully letting it in. So, yeah, I just realized with myself though, like, if I get too traumatized, I can't do my duties as a parent. I can't do my duties as a community member. I can't do my duties as a human being even. So I'm allowing myself as long of a break as I need from the extremely overwhelming information, And if that break was permanent, I would be okay with that. If you think about how humanity developed, we were living in these small tribal societies, very isolated.
Yeah.
The only news you'd possibly get is from a neighboring tribe who says, hey, here's what happened over there this year, You would just have a very slow trickle of news. And now we find ourselves in this place of just being besieged by information and news. And I don't know if our nervous systems are made to handle it.
That's good to hear too, because I think I've internalized along the way some stories about my own privilege in checking out from what's going on, that I'm privileged to be able to check out.
Right.
But I do feel very aware that like so much anger, so much sadness like is completely immobilizing. So
right. There's only so much, I don't like the idea that it's all of our responsibility to absorb all of the horrors of the world. And, to me, this trauma is collective and personal. We each carry our personal store of it. And, of course, we're part of this bigger movement of the collective. And now we live in a time of mass shootings and, very traumatizing and trauma-caused events. And the collective trauma just gets more and more powerful. And the individual trauma, when we are aware of it, gets more and more powerful. So I feel like almost everyone's walking around traumatized and not even aware of it, not even really having the tools know what it is that they're really dealing with. And then that trauma acts and causes more trauma. I think of myself, like I read, in the morning I would read these, stories on Facebook. And I'm very well intentioned in saying this sucks, and we need to do something about this. But then I can see it's kind of my trauma expressing itself. And then I'm releasing more trauma into the collective, So these are just some of the recent paths that I've been going on. And I had a realization not long ago that this trauma has built up in me. And now we rented a place in St. Augustine when I was visiting my dad. And blessedly, luckily, it didn't have internet. Huh. So for like 4 days, I would have to go to the coffee shop at the corner to get a little bit of internet. So it got me started on a news fast and an internet fast for a little while, which I feel has been good.
Are there other tools or practices in your life that have helped you to shift the personal traumas?
Well, for me, last year, for example, during the winter especially, it works well for me. Family life has a lot of demands, being a parent, and we're mostly live at home. Our son has, he's an only child, so he's used to us being quickly take care of whatever he needs. And he can just about keep both of us busy. So, you reach a certain point where you haven't done enough self-care, you haven't taken care of yourself. So for me, the thing that was really working in that season was climbing up the mountain behind our house and going deep into the woods, and just a little bit of that, and I would feel connected again. Just going out there, and I would cry out there. I would touch a tree. Like I found this one beautiful tree one day, and it was kind of crying from happiness, and it's just connection. So for me, that's a big therapy, spending time in the woods alone, especially for me. I feel like if you're trying to engage with a bunch of people out there, you're not going to get the full benefit of it, So for me, that's one of my powerful connection practices, and one that I've had since I was a child. As a kid and a teenager, kind of a disturbed teenager, I would go to the woods and I'd feel okay. Just a little time alone in nature. And then also I've been working on music lately again, and I feel like some of my songs are just a way to really quickly and artfully get my trauma out.
Totally.
Yeah. And that's been good. To me, it's not quite as effective as the immersion in nature. But, this time of year where we live, the weeds are all thick and there's ticks and there's different things going on. So it's a little harder for me to want to climb a mountain when it's hot and, a little bit overwhelming. We have an old bus that we converted into living space. So one of my lately little things is I've got it backed right up to a creek at the bottom of the property. So I'll just go in and I'll open up the back door of the bus and just sit there, with the creek and play music. Yeah. Wow. But I think people have to find some way. I think we live in a goal-driven society, and we're all so pushed, we're all pushed so fast. When we're on the highway, I just did that long highway drive to St. Augustine, and everything is so fast, just so relentlessly fast, and we push ourselves so hard. And I think we end up neglecting our own inner well-being a lot of times. And then we suffer for it. Even unconsciously we suffer, So a lot of my life now, like we're getting ready to build a tiny house. You may be aware of that, an earthbag tiny house. So my wife and I built our second house, which is 1,000 square foot, big earthbag place. And it's a big project. And we're 3 years in, and we still have a lot of work to do. We're still working on it. So kind of what I'm trying to encourage people, and I generally do this when people come to me and tell me, I want to build this structure. And people get a lot of big ideas, and you can buy plans for some really big stuff. I know some people in Florida who basically built a castle. And that is your freedom of choice and everything, but it's such a big commitment of time and energy. And we kind of have this philosophy in this country, bigger is better. If 100 square feet is okay, then 200 square feet is better, and then 5,000 square feet. And I was talking to a guy last night who does construction on these buildings like most people can't touch because they're so big. I mean, most contractors won't touch them.
This is an earthbag house?
No, this is conventional building. But this guy was telling me there's like 60,000 square foot residences and such, like mega mansions, you know.
What does that do to you to live in something like that too?
I guess it blows your ego up. Maybe it makes you feel safer being surrounded by all that space, and I just can't even imagine, you know. And so anyway, my thing when I'm trying to talk to people now about what kind of life do you want, I find, you know, the more stuff you have, the more clutter. You know, for me, organization's a hard thing. I think I'm kind of ADD, and I just tend to like put things off until I have to deal with them. I like the idea of the intentional tiny space living, having less. You know, when you own less owns you. So I'm kind of trying to figure out, you know, what is the best lifestyle for people? What is a life that we can live and be happy? And I'm thinking now of just trying to make a decompression place where people can come to decompress from modern life.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like, you know, God bless us, but humanity is just in such a rough state. And, you know, I went to the beach, and I'm sitting out on the beach, you know, looking out over the ocean, which I only get to see once every couple of years or so. And everybody's on their phones. Everybody on the beach is on their phones under their umbrella. And it's just, so much has changed for us, you know. We had basically 300,000 years of tribal living. And now we've got 100, you know, and the digital stuff's just 20 years old. You know, the smartphones is 10 years old. I don't think it's all serving humanity that well necessarily.
In your shift to a more minimalist life, I'm sure that's clarifying to kind of the basics of like what you actually need.
Yeah. Well, for me, one challenge is, you know, being into all the stuff I'm into. So music, there's a repertoire of objects that go with that, including guitars, basses, everything, tuner. There's all these items. But, you know, each little thing you're into, being a builder, I have all my tools. I'm into all these different things that all require, you know, their own set of tools. So for me, I guess it's a dance I'll have to do. You try to get rid of the unnecessary. And honestly, I do have a tendency to kind of probably hoard things to some extent. My wife is our family purger, which is good. I'm glad she's there to do that. For me, I have a complex relationship with objects. And we're building this tiny house, and I want it to be very clean and uncluttered in there. Minimal place to store and set things. Enough storage for cooking and everything else, but I just want people to be able to have a place that is simple and maybe just has a little more space and maybe just can inspire thoughts of, hey, this is nice. This simplicity is nice. So maybe for me, it's an attempt to deal with my own issues around all that, you know. But I like I said, just recently I've realized this trauma, it goes on. And I think we have to look as a people at what is it that traumatizes us and start weeding those things out.
Which for you, like you're saying, is some of the over-dependency on technology?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, I love technology. So that is my honest confession. I mean, you know, without technology, I would never have made the video that allowed you to see the video or allowed you to see our website. So I'm not an anti-tech person. But for us, our house is off-grid and we're solar and everything. So it's a little easier to not feel as bad about, you know, electricity use and everything else. And I think the technology is an amazing tool. I'm not saying it's bad. I can communicate, and I have to communicate with so many people now with our, you know, I get multiple contacts each day about workshops and different things we have going. So I have to be able to communicate with people quickly and effectively. But I think there do have to be places in our life where we can sit without being engaged in anything, where we can just simply be in the woods without even a goal, or we can sit alone for a little while. I feel like our lives are just now so cluttered with so many things, and the ability to stay endlessly entertained, endlessly clicking and surfing and everything else, you know.
We've forgotten the state of just being.
Right. The being is the bottom line of everything. But it's now so cluttered with so many activities and things that we have forgotten it. And we're running ourselves ragged, really, you know.
I wonder if and I realize this, I'm inherently asking you to put into words something that is undescribable, but I wonder if you could unpack the non-duality a little bit, because you said something along the way that I read about ecology being sort of the only practical way that you saw to integrate that, and I thought really resonated. And
yeah, well, you know, non-duality, to me, what would the essence of non-duality mean? It would mean connection. You could call it oneness, whatever you want to call it. And us being ecological beings living in an ecological system, we are intimately connected every moment to the planet and the resources it gives us and the air that the trees produce. And we wouldn't exist if air didn't exist in its capacity. If trees didn't convert enough of, you know, what was in the atmosphere before into oxygen, what we are wouldn't exist as we exist. Once again, on the other side, if we take enough trees down and affect the planet's ability to create oxygen, it negatively affects us. We put more carbon in the atmosphere by burning trees and forests to excess. We're really talking about connection versus the sense of disconnection. The disconnection is still rooted in connection, because what we are is connected beings. That's what we all are. But there's this overlay of ignorance, you know, which is maybe like the root ignorance, that we're separate. And then, of course, that can express itself as we're separate from other races, we're separate from other sexes, we're separate from other nationalities. That ignorance can take many shapes and forms. But when we look, we find that to not be true. We aren't separate. Breath in Latin is spirit. So spirit means breath. And really every breath we take is proof of connection. If we were cut off even for a moment from the air, you know, for a few minutes, we're dead. You know, so our whole life is proof of connection. But somehow, humanity, we found ourselves further and further in the idea of being isolated and being apart, disconnected. And then, of course, there's people who prey on those ideas and have great careers. Then you can create a whole host of fears to address, and you can create a whole lot of other things that aren't really serving people.
Yeah, as a father, what are sort of the values or the philosophies that you would like to bring your son?
Well, for one thing, we don't teach him fear. I'm an only child, so I never had a bunch of rough and tumble brothers who were getting me to do crazy shit. So I'm a little more probably reserved physically than a lot of men are. But my relationship with my son is, if he asks me a question, I'm going to try to answer it the best I can. And I will try to answer it in a vocabulary I think he can understand, but it'll be like I'm talking to an adult. We, of course, try to teach him love. Every parent, you try to teach them don't struggle, don't fight, you know, all these things. You get a good dose of human nature being a parent. You know, to see a child from birth, and he is now 5 years old, that's a big slice of life you're seeing. That's a big slice of life. I mean, and putting that into words is probably pretty hard. There's so many different phases. That's one thing that's interesting about being a parent. So you're relating to a being that's constantly changing and growing and integrating. But, you know, once again, we haven't taught him fear. We haven't taught him that anybody's skin color means anything. You know, we haven't taught him that somebody in a wheelchair is different. We haven't taught him, you know, with religion and God, you know, those little discussions occasionally come up. But we haven't taught him what all of that is. We're letting him form his own opinion on it. I would say I'm trying to leave space in his childhood for him to become who and what he wants to be.
I imagine he spends a lot of time outside.
He does, and he loves the digital world too, and it's hard. You know, I think as a parent, a lot of these days it's tempting, and I know people who've done it. When their child is young, you just give them a device, and you're like, just stay busy. And it's sad, very sad. So we try to avoid that. His media time is limited. But, you know, it's a tough thing. we as a species, we take to it so naturally, to media. I don't know, I guess entertainment. Maybe there's an urge in us for entertainment, you know. It's hard to hold the reins back on that.
Could you describe your property a little bit and talk about the community that you have there?
Sure. It's 12 acres, and we purchased it as a group. There were 4 families at the time that we purchased it, and we're down to 2 now. We've built structures on it. We've built a couple of Earthship-inspired earthbag houses. Earthships are the rammed tires and a bunch of south-facing glass usually. So they have a lot of thermal mass and a lot of passive solar, which keeps them comfortable. They were developed in Taos, New Mexico. So, you know, that's an area that gets cold in the winter and probably pretty hot in the summer as well. So this design can keep the structure comfortable year-round with very little energy usage, you know. So anyway, we have a couple of the houses of that design. One of our community members built a yurt, but you know, it's been abandoned for quite a number of years, and we're discussing what to do with it next. Like I said, we got the pool there, and we have a garden that slowly grows. Each year we try to add a planter or 2. It's a beautiful place where we live. I think I could safely say that we all feel a special connection to that area. And I feel like there is something pretty magical about it.
What were your intentions in creating community, and how did you sort of bring people together?
Well, my wife had a lot to do with that because, you know, I'm an only child. I can go into hermit mode pretty happily and easily for long periods of time. But my wife is from a larger family. Mary Jane is my wife, and she wanted community. She felt isolated. And once again, you know, I think that is the common thing. It's a common experience for a lot of us now, is feeling pretty isolated. And moms suffer the worst from nuclear family. I mean, women need support. I think in traditional cultures, you would have a bunch of moms. You'd have grandmoms, and everybody would be there. But I know especially I see mothers suffer from it, the nuclear family situation. It's just they're always taking on too much to handle. And then they reach burnout point, and there's a whole lot of different things that come from that, including health issues and everything else. So I think we just kind of live in an insular society largely. You can be in the middle of a city of millions of people, and I think you can still feel utterly disconnected. You know?
Oh, yeah. Not even know your neighbors. Yeah.
Yeah, not know your neighbors, not want to know your neighbors. I was telling some of my friends, they live in the Boston area now, and I was telling them, like, country people like visitors a lot of times because you're like, oh, I haven't seen anybody in a month. So, you know, but there just aren't that many people around, you know, so you still do what you can and visit when you can. But, you know, in the city, I think people are just kind of over each other. You're like, I drove an hour to work through breakneck traffic, and then something broke down, and I had to sit for 40, and now I drove an hour back. I've been surrounded by people all day. That kind of living kind of tends to make you more antisocial, I think.
Yeah, you need more filters, not less. Yeah.
But for me, my personal philosophy is I'm a fan of living in an area with more trees than people. That's my personal philosophy.
Amen. So this is maybe a little granular, but I'm really interested in intentional communities right now because I feel really called to live on the land, and I feel very aware that I need a family, I need a community to do that. So I wonder what you would suggest from your practical experience of how organized to be. Like I think my impression is that it's a little bit like being in like an open relationship. Like you need tons of communication.
Definitely a lot of communication, and communication breakdowns are where a lot of issues can happen. You know, I mean, there's any number of ways you can do it. Okay. And everybody has their comfort zone. Some people are more, I want to be very clear and spell everything out. Some people are more laid back. But one thing we've found, you know, and I think my wife and I have noticed this, like boundaries become a real thing in community, a real important thing to pay attention to. And it's a good place to learn about it. Because a lot of the disputes that come up are because there were unclear boundaries. You know, for example, an area around your space and yourself that you don't want anybody in. Now, if you're co-housing, that's a whole different thing. Some people like that real intense togetherness in the same structure and such. But, there's all these little different boundaries. And then, there's going to be common work for everybody to do. So how does that get split up so nobody feels resentful?
Right.
What structures are community? What structures are not community? We've just recently had a restructuring in our group. And I think that needs to be done. We're all growing people. We're learning and living and changing. So I think you have to be ready. And luckily, we're only 2 families. It's fairly simple for us to make changes. Of course, when you got 30 people or families and it's consensus, there's going to be probably a long debate. I think it's easy for people to get burned out in community or to feel their voice isn't getting heard if it's too big. And even sometimes if it's small, it might have that feeling of what I'm wanting or needing isn't really getting addressed. So there are quite a few challenges there. I think there's quite a few rewards too. I think you got to find your comfort zone. You have to look at your needs first. What are my needs in terms of space? What are my needs in terms of control of what goes on this piece of property? What are my needs? So I think it's good to get clear on your own needs and be as realistic as possible before you go in. I try to communicate clearly in community. I try to say, if something doesn't work for you, you have to speak up and say, hey, that doesn't really work. I don't really like that. We try to use nonviolent communication where if there is a dispute, we say, I feel this way. And that way we're not aiming it, you made me feel that way. That's disempowering. You know what I mean? That's a disempowering thing to say to somebody, you made me feel this. It's disempowering for yourself. So you're trying to take responsibility for your own feelings, and you're trying to state yourself in a way that is non-threatening and non-judgmental seeming or putting somebody on the spot. I guess violent communication would be isolating, like you messed up, this is your fault, those kind of things. It's a big learning curve having a community. I think it's really great. I was telling my friends not long ago, I don't know if I'll ever really be a tribal person. In fact, I'm pretty certain I won't be a tribal person, a tribal-minded person.
Which is what?
Well, we have a family we know, the Ropers. They're a big family, and they're kind of a tribe. They all grew up, raised by the same parents, David and Tanya. And they have similar values and, of course, biologically the same, all kinds of similarities across many fields. I would say they're about as close to a tribe as I've ever seen. But, I was raised an only child, entertaining myself through a lot of different media. I was the first video game generation. And I just think it's hard, the way we were raised, to transfer to that where you're really living in close proximity, just right there with each other, and you kind of have to work it out. It's just, I don't know if intention can bridge that gap.
The shared intention of...
Well, what I mean is I just don't know if, our goal in the beginning is to be a tribe. That was our goal in this community. And, we love each other, and we have a lot of shared values, and we love each other's families. We all love each other. But, a tribe is just... I think tribes are born. I do give us, once again, like we're talking about, no matter how small of a thing you do to protect the environment, I think it's worthwhile. No matter how small of a thing you do to enhance community or to create community, I think that's worthwhile. But just trying to be honest, about what I've realized about myself, I like my personal space and my alone time. Very crucial. And probably in a true tribal situation, there wouldn't be much of that. Being a loner in those times and in that place meant short life expectancy. We take a hospital and all these things for granted now, and somebody's going to be an expert and they're going to patch you up if you get hurt. But in those days, the tribe was survival. If you're out on your own and you slip and hurt your leg, you're probably done. They were living kind of at the edge of survival. A drought wouldn't be fixed by somebody else bringing in supplies and saving you. You had to figure out how to survive. So yeah, I think they did have a different mindset with a lot of it. But the tribe was what you relied on, So I was telling that to a friend that I didn't think I'd ever be a tribal person, and he said, well, maybe, you and I would have been medicine men or something in a different thing. Someone who steps maybe outside of the culture a little bit and does something different. So maybe that outsider view can serve the tribe.
I feel like perhaps you're doing that in a way with how many people you're empowering and teaching.
Yeah, I would like to. I mean, I would like to reach as many people as possible. And I think just showing people options, like earthbag building, letting people realize you can have one of these for cheaper than you can a mobile home. And it's a much more powerful structure. It's non-toxic, stronger, all these advantages. So I do think one way is showing people options that they may not have been aware of. Because, until you're aware of an option, it is as if it doesn't exist. You could be surrounded by endless options, but until you're aware of it, then you don't have any connection to it or anything.
And you do a lot of workshops where people are really hands-on doing the building.
Yeah. We try to, at workshops, we try to get everybody as much hands-on as they want.
Could you build an earthbag house basically anywhere?
You could, I feel like each area, each kind of environment you would build in, you'd have to make special considerations. Here, for example, very wet. The first earthbag book I read, Earthbag Building, creative name, I know, but it's a great book. They built in the desert. So in that book, there's really not much a mention of vapor barriers, sealing water. So each place has its own considerations, Extreme cold climates, earthbag may not be the best. I think there are certain things that could make it doable. But I think, if I lived in Alaska, I would probably do like straw bale or something with super high insulative value. That's what I would probably be more interested in. And we're wanting to create a place, probably in like southern Colorado, maybe northern New Mexico, where, as I was saying before, a place where people can decompress, but also to showcase different building methods. I would like to do a straw bale. You can use volcanic rock, scoria. Pumice is also another one to fill the bags with, and then you make an insulative earthbag wall. So that could be an exception in some of these colder climates. You could use that as the wall form. Yeah, we're wanting to demonstrate multiple different kind of housing techniques. Do an underground house just so people can get the full experience of something that's totally underground.
I'm so struck as you're talking that, like, of course our dwellings should reflect our environments. Like, it's such a modern mindset to think, like, a house everywhere just looks the same.
I know, yeah. If you look at traditional societies, all they had to work with is what was in their immediate surroundings. And, in this area we have so much timber. We have, of course, earth. We have plenty of materials. But yeah, it's hard to get out of that mindset of go to Lowe's and pick up everything you need. It's hard to do. It's just so convenient. But I guess getting materials from your own site is even more convenient if you can do it right.
Yeah, what is your relationship with convenience? Because I imagine what you've done is pretty serious hard work.
Oh, it is hard work. I do feel like if you're not doing something that you're willing to suffer for, then maybe it's not worth doing.
Tell me about that, yeah.
Well, I feel like I'm kind of lazy by nature. I feel like I'm kind of a lazy person. I was a bachelor for a long time. I lived in that little mobile home down in Florida with my little AC wall unit. And I didn't really do anything until after I met Mary Jane and we decided to build this house and we got into this whole lifestyle. So I think by nature I'm lazy, but the freedom financially and just the ability to be able to build a better structure on your own was a big call to me. And the fact that you can do it so inexpensively, and I think that's what kind of partially what got me into it. So I've worked very hard at this life, but you got to fit in breaks too as you go. Sustainability to me isn't just you're building houses a certain way. It's the way you're building. Is your back going to blow out, if you keep pushing yourself too hard? I feel like sustainable is a whole life philosophy. And now I'm trying to fit in more space. A lot of us, I think, trying to do alternative lifestyles or homesteading, living off grid, we push ourselves too hard. And you can hurt yourself physically and psychologically, I think. So to me, the sustainability is a much bigger thing than just the type of materials you're using. For example, at this tiny house workshop, I want to make sure everybody's taking enough time. Uncle Mud, one of our friends, Chris McClellan, who was just doing some workshops out of the property, he said, take the day in the middle off. Go have a river day or something, And I think that's a good idea. To me, that's what we've got to incorporate. I know we have this work ethic and we feel driven and we got things we're trying to accomplish, and I understand all that. But, we don't want to traumatize ourselves too much in the process,
So does that speak a little bit to what you were saying about your shifting sort of goals or intentions for what you're doing now?
Yeah. You try to form an alternative life because you feel like ultimately it'll be easier. It'll be better. Of course, that's why you try to do something different. But if you're pushing yourself relentlessly all the time and you're not giving yourself the chance to recuperate, to have some recreation, and if you're not resting right and sustainably, we talk about it at the property, everybody out there, all the adults, we're all parents, and you can't give from an empty cup. If you let your cup get empty, you just have nothing to give, and then you're not going to have a good relationship with your family and your children and everything else.
I noticed that with myself as an artist a lot, that I mean, there is just that need to get things out that feels like a sort of like itch I have to just scratch, relieve. But I also can really judge myself by my output, by my productivity.
Yeah.
And that in turn affects the actual thing that's coming out of me. And I've noticed that a lot.
Yeah, for me, usually art is just like a crap you can't hold anymore.
Yes.
It's just like, okay, I'm just going to start playing this thing.
Totally.
We had this day a ways back, and my wife was in kind of a mood and having a hard time, and I was just in this mood, and there was all these powerful feelings, so I just picked up the card and I started writing this song. And that song kind of became one of my favorites of the new stuff I've written. It's called Republican Jesus. But very therapeutic, though. I feel like music is such great therapy.
And that's part of what's so beautiful about it is, like, as it comes out of you to heal you, then it becomes an offering that does the same for other people.
Yeah. I was watching a documentary about Townes Van Zandt, and, I think he basically drank himself to death and kind of a tortured guy, but, he wrote these kind of heavy songs, I don't know, are you pretty familiar?
Yeah.
See, you're probably more familiar with his stuff than I am, but I saw the documentary, and, and they put an article in like Rolling Stones or an ad, and it said, if Townes' music has affected you, write us and let us know. And people were just saying, he saved my life, 10 times, saved my life 20 times. Yeah, so I think those feelings of trauma and such, if they're put out there in a certain way, can help heal or at least identify, here's kind of a piece of the collective thing,
Yeah. Well, do you have any words of wisdom for anyone that's dealing with sort of despairing feelings right now?
Well, for myself, and as I said earlier, I'm narrowing down the information I get about the state of the world, and I'm trying to focus on my immediate surroundings. And I don't feel personally like it's our individual human responsibility to take all of the horrors and all of the bad news that's out there and filter it through our nervous system every day and through our brain and our psyche. I do understand people saying we need to stay aware of what's going on. It's a dangerous time to disconnect. I understand all of these things. But one thing the mainstream news doesn't do is expose us to the alternatives, to the people who are doing things. It doesn't expose us to that as much. So when we are letting ourselves fall into that gravity well of all that negativity, we're missing a big part of the picture. We aren't being given a big part of the picture. And I think we're much better served by creating something that addresses that and something that tries to talk to the connection that is, I feel like, the medicine for all of us.
I've noticed that too when I localize more. It's like the quote unquote bad stuff is still, it's coming in through the osmosis of being in community with people, but I have much more access to, the stories that the mainstream media it doesn't serve them or serve their corporate interests to pass along, and I feel much more empowered as a person in this body in these
Right.
times.
That to me is a dangerous thing, is the disempowerment that can come on us when we're allowing ourselves just to be exposed to this information of stories that are beyond our control and power. And we're allowing ourselves to be exposed to a lot of this. We feel smaller and smaller and more disempowered all the time. Where is our place of authority and our place of creation in our own life? So to me, I know what work I need to do. I'm taking steps to be more sustainable, taking steps to have less of a negative impact on the environment, taking steps to make us more self-reliant, grow our own food, etc. So really, these are the best places for me to spend my energy. I feel this is my current feeling about it.
Yeah.
So I think whatever somebody does to connect, to feel that connection, to empower themselves, I think it's good.
Yeah.
And take some of the maybe take some of the attention and energy away from collective things that are beyond our control.
Yeah.
And power to do anything about.
Yeah. I heard a woman on Instagram the other day actually saying that she'd even released the idea that humans needed to stop the apocalypse, if you will.
Right.
That's sort of a continuation of human-centric ideas to think
Right.
that it's not the prerogative of the earth to cleanse herself, and instead she was just going to say, all that I can do, my only responsibility is to be the best steward of the land that I can be right now. And I was like, that I can live with that. That's manageable.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I come to this realization from time to time, and then, kind of the lure of social media, it's so easy to get up in the morning with a cup of coffee and go through my news feed and just pretty soon be overwhelmed, even unconsciously be overwhelmed. I do feel like until we can deal with our collective trauma, the news is going to get crazier. And each event feeds back into that feedback loop. There's more collective trauma now, more collective trauma. And it's just this powerful feedback loop. Maybe we just need to step away from it a little bit. That being said, I do plan to vote, and I do plan to stay informed about the candidates. I plan to do all these things. I plan to stay engaged, but I just feel my best engagement is when I'm not overwhelmed by a lot of things I can't do anything about.
Yeah. Do you have any places that you feel like are good for people to focus just in terms of like basic consumption?
Well, recently we started addressing the little microplastic uses, or straws at a restaurant for one thing. And what our favorite restaurant has these big styrofoam containers. So we quit taking those and we got our own little, reusable that we now can keep in the car. And instead of getting crappy little plastic spoons when we get food at a place, we keep a couple of steel spoons in the car. All of those little things are a help. Some people poo-poo it and say, oh, it doesn't matter. Or I think the Trump campaign started giving out plastic straws like, just use it all up, put it all out into the environment as quick as possible. But to me, any little thing somebody does, I do feel like the most dangerous thing and tempting to us is to give up. And unfortunately, a lot of the doomers, they give you all this data about the earth is effed and we have messed it up and there is no chance and there's, and boom, boom, boom. And they're like, well, what are you doing about it? They're like, doing about it? There's nothing you can do about it. That's very disempowering. That's not good to me. That's not a good place you want to be. You're just surrendering to this destructive society, and you're like, oh, we're all screwed anyway. It's the same as a apocalyptic Christian who's like, oh, it's all screwed anyway. I don't need to try, or I don't need to do anything. It's all going to fall to shit. So I think it's a dangerous mindset to be in,
Well, thank you. Thank you for using your life to empower people and teach people. And you've already inspired me a lot. I think after I watched your Earth Bag video, I spent like 5 hours just reading about alternative structures. And
yeah, I'm a big believer in the Earth Bag thing. I'm glad we talked about some other than that. But that's kind of, a lot of people talk to me about it, and I see growing interest in it. And I think there's a lot to be said for it. I'm a believer in it big time.
Yeah.
And we're doing this tiny house thing, and then there's going to be a Mother Earth News article that comes out of that. And I'm wanting to do Building a Sustainable Life, which is a book about, our building projects and sustainability projects. And then I'm going to do a DVD too, hopefully out of this same tiny house build footage. called Dirt Simple, which is about earth bag building. So these are a bunch of the projects that are coming up. As I said, I just sort of have my own little trajectory I'm in now. And I just feel like the collective trauma has to be addressed. And probably the best way is to address our own personal trauma and to lessen our personal trauma. I think that's the best way to do it. And if we can do that, then I think we can truly create something different, something from joy instead of fear or, desperation.
Yeah, I used to be very resistant to the idea that the only work we could do or the important work to do was on ourselves because I was like, yeah, but the world's on fire. And I think the more that I've worked on myself, the more I've realized that like that is the lens through which we do everything.
Yeah. The disconnect we see, I talked to this lady at a coffee shop in Weaverville, and she said people aren't even connected to their own bodies. We even feel disconnected from the very own thing we're in and the horrible things people do to their bodies dietarily, and of course all the different destructive drugs and such.
It's the microcosm for the macrocosm.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We do the same thing to the environment that people are doing to their very own bodies. So I think we have to look at that consciousness that's doing that and say, why? Why is this so destructive on the micro and the macro level? And self-destructive. It's strange. Something to be so dedicated to self-destruction, on all levels.
It's a sickness for sure. Yeah.
Maybe it is the trauma. I don't know.
I think so. And what you were saying about the disempowerment of like we've given away so much to these outside forces that just don't have our best interest.
Right. And don't even know we've given it away.
Yeah. Yeah. Gotta take it back. Gotta take it back.
Yeah. And it's easy to do. I mean, I think as soon as you start taking steps in the direction you want to go with your life and your energy and your sacred purpose, then you find that you are empowered.
Yes.
And you find that there aren't all these forces you may have imagined who are out to squash you. You're doing what you need to do, and then that shows other people that that's possible for them as well.
It's your responsibility, I feel like, in a way, to do that healing work and then to manifest. Yeah.
Right. And I think we just have so many of us just don't even know we're wounded. And, we've just learned, carry on, soldier on, just keep going. I've got a new song called Hurry Up and Get Over It. And, it's just like, hurry up and get over it. We don't got time for this shit. There's things to do and places to be, and someone's got to stimulate the economy. Oh, boy. Yeah. So I think that we just have to address that and spend some time with it. Allow the pain just to tell its story and the trauma, and allow it to come out and say what it needs to say.
Not be afraid to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Yo, he's the best. I'm so grateful for people that are transparent about what's going on with them. It helps me contextualize some of the anxieties and fears that I grapple with. If you want to connect with Morgan, you can find him at morgancaraway.com or sustainablelifeschool.com, and his music project, You're Awesome, YOUR Awesome, is online as well. You can always find me, maurajames.com, and on Instagram at maurajames and unbroken.chain. I want to end on a funny note. I was listening to some Carlin this week, and I came across this clip when he was on Johnny Carson in 1980, and he had a little bit about stuff in his opening, like objects, possessions. It hit home for me because as a nomad for the last 6 months, I have a very intimate relationship with all the stuff that I own because I touch every piece of it and put it in my trunk and take it out. And it's been really interesting how downsizing from a New York City apartment, which is already fairly modest by some people's standards, to a packed Toyota Yaris, to now a pretty packed trunk of a Toyota Yaris. As I move around, I become so aware of the objects I own that go from things that I absolutely needed at one point and purchased that over time have become stuff, and some of it even a nuisance. And what a joy it's been to shed a lot of that. Every time I move, I shed a little bit more and shed a little bit more. And what I've found is that there's so much more room in me to be nourished and satisfied by my relationships, by the things that I'm making, by preparing food with intention. And I still have a long way to go. I have a couple boxes in friends' basements that I realized recently I don't even quite remember what's in them, which says a lot about how important they must be. So when Morgan was talking about his relationship to stuff and hoarding, and particularly the accoutrement of being an artist of many mediums, I thought of Carlin, and I wanted to send us all out with this. Enjoy your forest bathing. Don't panic. We're so in this together, and I'm really grateful for the ways that you are applying your life force and your imagination to making this spaceship way more sustainable for all of us.
Pardon me, I do have a little desk out here tonight, sort of. This is my office, after all, when I'm here. There's my desk, which actually is just a little place for my stuff. When you think about it, that's all. I just wanted to put some things there. You have to have a little place for your stuff, you know? Don't you? That's why they have glove compartments and pockets and drawers on a desk. You gotta have a place for your stuff. That's all you need in life, a place for your stuff. That's all your house is when you think about it. It's just a place for your stuff. I'll tell you this, if you didn't have so much stuff, you wouldn't need a house. A house is just a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff. In fact, sometimes you gotta move. No room for your stuff. You gotta get a bigger place, because that's all a house is a big pile of stuff. Everybody's got a little pile of stuff. Everybody got a pile of stuff, and you lock your stuff up when you leave. You gotta lock your stuff, huh? Somebody might come along and take some of your stuff. And they always take the good stuff. You notice it. They never bother with all that trash you're saving. Do you ever notice when you go to somebody else's house that you don't quite feel at ease? You know why? No room for your stuff. Somebody else's stuff is all over the place. No wonder you feel dumb there. You go to somebody's house and you're not expecting to stay overnight. You know that situation? Just going over for dinner. Have a little cocoa and gin or something, whatever your style. Just a little something for the evening, but you're not supposed to stay over, but then the bridge is washed out and you do. They give you a little bedroom that they haven't used in years. You know, in fact, someone died in it 11 years ago. And they haven't moved any of his stuff. Or any kind of little bedroom they give you, there's always a little dresser right next to the bed, and there's never any room for your stuff. Why? Somebody else's crap is all over the top of the dresser. Have you noticed that their stuff is crap and your crap is stuff? You say, get that crap out of my way and let me put my stuff down. Now, sometimes when you go on vacation, you got to bring some of your stuff with you. Can't bring all of your stuff. You bring just the stuff you know you're going to need for 2 weeks, about 2 weeks worth of stuff. And you go over to the big hotel in Honolulu, going to be there for 2 weeks, and you open up your stuff and you start putting your stuff out because you got to have some stuff. You don't feel so good because you're half a world from home, but here's your stuff, so everything must be okay, just putting your stuff there. And you start to feel all right after a day and a half. That's when your friend from Maui calls up. Says, why don't you come over and spend the weekend over here? So, wow. Now what do I pack? Right, you got to pack an even smaller version of your stuff, the third version of your house. Just enough stuff for a weekend on Maui. You get over there and you put up your stuff, a little Visine, you put it on the windowsill, whatever you have, you put your stuff up and you start to feel okay. It takes about an hour and a half. You know you're extended now. Supply lines are getting longer and harder to maintain. You've got stuff here, stuff there, and stuff way back there. But you finally get your stuff put up and it's okay after about an hour. That's when your friend says, hey, I think tonight we'll go over the other side of the island and spend the night at my friend's house. Wow. Now what do you bring? Just whatever's in your hand.